Sir Isaiah Berlin is just finishing his lecture on the Romantics. I'll let him do that, and then he and I can talk a little bit.
What then were the results of Romanticism? Liberalism, decency, toleration, and an appreciation of the imperfections of life. Aiming at one thing, the Romantics produced, fortunately for us all, nearly the exact opposite. Thank you very much for listening to these 6 long lectures.
Bravo, Isaiah, bravo. You finished with your lecture now?
Me? Finished with the lecture? Yes, indeed, why not?
Wonderful. Now, you go away a little bit because it's your birthday today, and I'm going to speak a little bit into my mobile phone about how wonderful you are and what advice you may have given us today. So, catch you a bit later. Isaiah would have been 111 today. What would he have told us about the social and political challenges that we face? It's June 2020. And there is a lot going on in the world. But the biggest issue that we face this century remains climate breakdown. What would Isaiah Berlin have told us about this issue? Well, first of all, he would have accepted the size of the problem. He wouldn't have been a lukewarmer. He would have recognized that we are facing civilization altering consequences and potential catastrophe. He wouldn't have thought that the survival of the species is imminently threatened. He wouldn't have believed that Western societies are remotely close to civilizational collapse. But he would have seen civilization altering consequences on the horizon in the decades to come. His prescription would have been sober and challenging for a lot of people. Because he would have said the solution, the only solution, the only game in town is liberal gradualism. And the role and the benefit of all of these movements and voices out there that want radical change is just to get these damn liberal democracies to do more and to do more quickly. And that's it. There is nothing else. The only way we can replace the liberal democratic institutions we've got is by replacing them with deteriorated and evacuated versions of them. And that ain't gonna be helpful for climate change. That's only gonna mean that we have less capacity to make the desperately needed changes quickly enough. So what about democratic decline? What about the fact that liberal democratic institutions are not just failing to go global, but are coming to seem more and more fragile in the West itself? What would Isaiah Berlin's counsel to us on that have been? He would have said, don't panic. Keep your eyes on the ball. Be aware of what the real panic button is. And the real panic button is when you're getting close to a situation where these guys who are in power can no longer be voted out. Everything you do has to bring it about that you are at the furthest possible distance from this situation. That's the real buffer you have to watch out for. You don't want to drift anywhere near that situation. At the moment, we've got a distinction between two kinds of opportunistic and exclusionary authoritarian populists in the world. There's the bunch who haven't consolidated control over the political system. There is the bunch who don't run everything yet, who can't tell what the courts should do, who don't control the electoral commission. And then there is the bunch which has consolidated power in this way. Viktor Orban has pretty much got there in Hungary. And this means that it's difficult to get these guys out at an election. And that is, for Isaiah Berlin, the bottom line. That's what we have got to avoid. What about the crisis and race relations tragedy going on in the United States today? Well, I think Isaiah Berlin's instinct here would have been to try to keep out of it as much as possible. He would have been keen on certain kinds of political language. He would have been uncomfortable with the term economic violence. He would have been uncomfortable with it because he would have wanted to keep the concept of violence tied to actual physical violence and nothing else. So he would have wanted to place what a lot of people would call economic violence under the tag of social justice, social injustice, economic injustice, but he wouldn't have said that it's necessarily a case of violence. He would have said it's something terrible about which we ought to complain in other terms, in terms of other values, but not via using the language of violence. And he would have sounded an optimistic note too, because he would have said, look, the history of American race relations is in part a history of great victories over racism, and we mustn't forget that too. Isaiah Berlin would have warned us that social justice progress, progress for ethnic minorities, progress for sexual minorities, progress for women, is always reversible. We tend to have the feeling that when we make a step forward on a certain social justice issue, that we might get stuck there, but if any change occurs, it'll be just another forward step. And Isaiah would have said, no, you can actually imagine the rights of various groups being rolled back over the course of a few years. And that's not something that should strike us as being unintelligible or bizarre. It's part of the natural course of political and historical life. The advice Isaiah Berlin would have given to politicians about how to represent the rights of certain groups when the rights of these groups might be resented by a majority of the population, or when where the discourse around the rights of these groups might be resented by a majority of the population. Here Isaiah Berlin would have asked politicians to try to frame protecting the rights of these folks in rather inclusive and universal language, and not the language of identity politics. And a lot of people might find that challenging, but he would say, look, you might, as a politician in private, use language about the trans community, that the trans community uses about itself, but try to not use that language in public. As a politician, you should aim to say, if you're trans, I'm going to protect your rights because you are a British citizen or because you are an American citizen. And I'm going to protect your rights as a British citizen, as an American citizen. And in the end, hopefully you will feel that your rights are protected enough. But I'm not going to spend too much time talking about protecting the rights of trans people. And the reason Isaiah would have given for this wouldn't be so much theoretically grounded. It wouldn't be grounded in what political philosophers would be familiar with from the writings of the great John Rawls. It wouldn't be because Isaiah feels that politicians should stay neutral about various conceptions of the good. It's rather because he thinks it wouldn't pay. He thinks that the rights of many groups will go into retreat further and further, actually, if the discourse that these groups want politicians to use about their rights is the discourse that politicians use about their rights. Isaiah would have just said, look, this is actually just going to both undermine the rights of these people and also create unnecessary division in society. So the more you can break out of the lingo of identity politics, the better. Even though you might still be addressing the same social justice issues, but just without framing them in that language. Isaiah Berlin wouldn't have given us a solution to the problems of disinhibition that social media generates, the problems of fake news and echo chambers. But he would have been deeply worried about this. And he would have been worried because he felt that there was a connection between, on the one hand, the sustenance of democratic institutions, and on the other hand, the chances of a truthful statement to be heard and to gain assent in virtue of it being a truthful statement. And in this regard, he would have asked two things of academic colleagues. He would have said, look, stay in your lane. Don't go around proclaiming on subjects about which you don't know much. So stick with your particular expertise. But when you are sticking with your particular expertise, be confident and make clear that if people get rid of your authority, they're going to get rid of a pillar that is part of what holds a democratic society together. What about the fact that a lot of people just feel lost, just feel that the world's spinning out of control and there is nothing anybody seems to be able to do about it? What would Isaiah Berlin have said to you if you feel like that? He'd have said, look, I understand, but it's important not to fall for the delusion that the future has to be like the recent past. The future is going to be like the past in general. It doesn't have to be like the recent past. And if your recent past is a period of relative stability and relative prosperity, your expectations of what is possible may be too fragile and too precious. Isaiah would have also warned everybody, but particularly a certain kind of progressive, that teleology is something we can no longer believe in. The idea that history has a progressive tendency built into it. The idea that we might experience steps back, but that in the end we're going to experience more steps forward than steps back. And Isaiah would have been generous here. He wouldn't have said, you silly people who believe in teleology. He wasn't into us and them in explaining what is happening under a particular culture. He would have said, look, there is an idea that we can't quite believe in anymore, but it's an idea that still has a pull over many of us, and it pulls us in to some extent, some of the time, and we need to watch for that, because when we stop watching for it, we can lose track of what we need to do to fight for our own political interests. We can get complacent. We can get delusional. And one of the examples, as I would have given here, are some people on the Remain side of the Brexit conflict in the United Kingdom. He would have said to many Remainers, look, I'm on your side, but it's important that we get rid of the idea that we only lost the referendum because the other side were irrational, or they benefited from malign foreign interference, or they were just in the grip of some outbreak of irrationality, and that inevitably a reasonable and rational assessment of what should have happened favors us, and one way or another history must return us to where we should have gone in 2016 but didn't. And what's very unhealthy about that for Isaiah is that you've got a situation where people on whose side he would have been lost, but they're not quite seeing that they lost. They're refusing to fully admit it, and as a result are stuck in a certain way, incapacitated and unable to even defend and advocate for their own interests. A final thought from Isaiah might be that we should take the broadest possible historical perspective, that we should not panic every time we go around the corner and encounter something new or difficult, unless we must panic. We shouldn't be scandalized unless we need to be scandalized. We should try to practice as much effective politics as possible. Expressive politics is good too, but it's not as good. And life's extraordinary, and not just in personal life, but also in history. There is always the possibility to be surprised. And not all surprises have to be painful and unlovely.